So making an apple galette is kind of fun. One thing that give you a little background on it, it's called a galette, but it also is referred to as a crostade, depending on what type of cuisine you're doing. If you're doing French cuisine, then it's a galette, and if you're doing crostade, it's an Italian name. Also, that a galette is a free form pie, and so there's some pros and cons to it. The pros are you can do any different sizes you want. You can use different ingredients to fill it. It doesn't have to be apple. You can use berries or other sliced fruits, such as pears, cherries. So you can make the same kind of pies as you would in a formed pie. The downside is you have to have this perfect, otherwise it's going to leak all over. So with the starting ingredients, we're going to start with 1 cup of all-purpose flour. And so again, making sure it's the all-purpose, not the cake pastry or bread flour. And to that, we're going to add 2 tablespoons of sugar, and then 1/4 teaspoon of kosher salt. Again, following like my other stuff, I don't sift it just because of the kosher salt, and those grains would get stuck. However, you do want to whisk it or mix it in. And to that, I'm going to add a little bit of butter, and always frozen. Always frozen makes that nice flaky dough. This is a little bit different than other presentations though, because you've seen me in other presentations where I take and really mix that butter in and get it nice and flaky. This one I'm going to leave a little bit heavier. And so with the butter being frozen, I still have time to work with it, but I want to try to pull the flakiest dough that I can out of this because it's going to have such heavy weight of fruit sitting on it. I want to give it the best chance to be flaky. So after the butter is all grated, simple enrobing where you try to keep your body heat away from that fat, and because it defeats the purpose of it being frozen. Then once I have it actually mixed in, then I'm going to actually start and do that process where I do take maybe half of it and kind of flake it to where it's more of a I guess it would be like smearing the butter in my thumbs to get that flakiness. So it's going to be a drier dough when it first starts out, and I don't want you to panic, because the next step when we add the water, you'll want to add more water, because you'll see this is a dry dough when we start out here. So make my little pool, and then I've taken ice and put water in it to make ice water. Again, keeping with the theme of keeping it nice and cold. The butter's still cold. Adding the ice water to this, it still gives it more chance. And then keeping my fingers on the outside of the bowl and just flicking the butter mixture into it to keep that cold as long as possible. As you can see, the cold part is pretty important. So start bringing this together. Again, resist trying to put more liquid in this. I know it's tempting, but a little of that fat will start to warm just from the simple process of mixing it together. And as soon as it starts coming together, as you can see, as I'm squeezing it, it's starting to form. When I pick up, say, 90% of this in here, I'm going to just take and turn it out onto the actual board, or in this case, onto the granite, and then finish it and make it into a puck. But I've got almost everything out of there. It's come together, but there's no real form to it yet. So again, I want to be careful, and I'm going to press it out. And all I'm going to do is form a puck with it. As you can see those flaky layers in there. That's what we want. That's what's going to turn into gold later, and be able to have that flaky crust, even though we're using a heavy fruit. And I think that's important to know, especially when you're doing a free form like this, that you need the integrity of that dough to really hold together. So the best thing to do now, since we have worked that gluten, is take it, scoop it up. Notice I got that puck size that I want. I'm just going to throw it in a plastic bag. You can throw it in plastic wrap, doesn't matter. I'm going to refrigerate that for 1 hour. As that's setting and chilling, I can do my mise en place on my apples. So with my apples, you want to pre-wash them. I like to dry them a little bit. Don't like to work with them wet, and go through and peel them. Now we're actually paring the apples. So we've got 3 of them, and I'm going to show you a couple of different ways to peel it. So you can see I'm just going around the top of it and peeling down. Now when I peel the apples, it depends on how many I'm doing. With this nice sharp, I've got a new peeler and it works really good, so it's fine. And the reason I want it sharp is I can take very, very little. I want to keep as much apple as possible to it. Remember the food cost, and it just makes a better product. If I was doing cases upon cases, I might consider using a paring knife, and also it helps your skills getting it down. But if you look at the actual peels of how much apple is actually left on the peel, there's not a lot. And so really the key here is to have a nice sharp peeler. And so other ways of doing it, I'm just going to show you a couple different ways. Just I worked with different cooks, different chefs, and they have different ways of peeling. There's even peelers, automated peelers, that you can stick the apple on, put the blade on, turn the apple, and you make one huge long peel, which is kind of fun. But it tends to take a little too much fruit off for my liking. So especially with working just with 3 little apples, it doesn't take long. This third one, I'm going to try to take and rip a whole peel for you, get it as long as I can, and kind of show you that once you start it, you can keep going. And it kind of also shows and speaks to the sharpness of the peeler. And I know I probably have 6 or 7 peelers at home, and I bought a new one. And I don't know why I don't throw the other ones away. But I need to, because once they're dull, there's really nothing you're going to be able to do about it, and they're so inexpensive. It doesn't prove to keep it for a long time. So as you can see, you can peel that whole thing. So there's different ways to do it. Again, make sure you compost that leftover peeling. I'm going to just set it off to the side here so I can keep working. Now when cutting your apples, there's a couple different things that I want you to pay close attention to. So I'm going to drop the knife straight down through and cut all my apples in half first. So I know I have 1/4 of the apples, and that's coming, but let's get them all in half first. And then once they're in half, I take the halves and cut them into quarters. And I'm trying to replicate this to where how you would do it too, instead of just one at a time. So this way, if you're doing large productions, you can do it this way. Because you'll notice that I haven't sped the video up at all. I am working fairly quickly, and the reason I'm working quickly is these apples are going to start turning brown. Some of the brown spots you see are just bruises in the apples. It's not from what they call enzymatic oxidization, to where your apples or potatoes turn brown without being in water, and I don't want these to be in water. So what I'm doing right there is I'm cutting the core out. I'm just taking just the core. And if you look real close on an apple when you're doing this, you can see where to cut. You can see where you'll take that 45-degree cut and actually pull that core out. That'll take your seeds out, and that'll take all the little seed pocket membrane out of there too, so you'll have a nice soft apple. So just working safely, but with a little intensity to it, just because, like I said, these will start turning brown. And if I was doing a large batch, then I would have an acidulated, or a water with acid in it. That's all that means, is acidulated. And then I would soak them in there. But again, I don't want that extra liquid. These are fairly dry, so that's what I want to work with. Just take them, start cutting them. And as you cut the apples, since this is free form, or what they consider a rustic apple pie, I'm just going to slice them up. If you want to take the time and you feel like you have the skill level to do it, you can take and actually slice your apples nice and slow and keep them all together, and you can actually lay those out. It's a little bit different way of doing it, and you have to put your ingredients, but you have to put your ingredients in differently too. But if you can do a little research on that. But I would suggest just doing it rough for the first time, because there's going to be enough challenge to this, to where doing it the first time just rustic is probably the way to go. This is the way you do it if you were laying it out. You'll see a lot of pears done this way, where they actually peel the pears and then slice it real thin and then fan it out and then put that on the actual tart shell like that. So you can do that, but again, I'd suggest just stick with the rustic. It's going to be easiest. So getting these apples done. Once I'm done, I'm going to be adding the ingredients to it. Please work at your own safe place. Again, I was just doing this to get my mise en place done for the production of this. And just that quick, 3 apples are done. So to this pretty simple, straightforward recipe, I'm going to add 1/4 cup sugar and 1/4 cup flour. And in mixing this in, one of the things you can do is you can practice some of the tossing movement, and I'll show you what that looks like. Add 1 teaspoon of cinnamon and 1/2 teaspoon of nutmeg and 1/4 teaspoon of kosher salt. That salt is going to go in there and it's going to do 2 things. That kosher salt is going to actually take and start drawing out the liquid from the actual apples. And as that, because it acts as 2 things. One, it acts as a preservative, acts as a flavor. And the reason it acts as a preservative, it tends to pull liquid out. So this is what I meant about you can practice your tossing. Again, try to keep the apples in the actual bowl. And if it's your first time, you may want to have something underneath so you can catch them and reuse them so they don't go on the floor or just all over the house. So it's just a little trick. It helps circulate all of the apples to get all of the surfaces covered. So again, easy way to practice, and it's the same method as if you're sauteing. So check, make sure things aren't stuck together. Give them a little rub. That sugar likes to make things stick. And so you have that. If you were to let this sit, you would actually see a little bit of the liquid starting to draw out of those apples from the use of that salt. Other things you can add to this just as you're going along. Again, for this first one, you can just stick with straight cinnamon. If you don't have nutmeg, you don't have to add the nutmeg. But certainly you can experiment with a little bit of orange zest in there. Is always nice. So we're going to add 4 ounces of pea-sized butter. This butter does not have to be frozen. It can be a little bit warmer. I like it just refrigerated. And you're going to just take and bust it up and get it into pea size. The reason you want pea size is that way as it melts at the temperature we're going to be cooking at, as it melts, it's going to have time to work with the apples to caramelize the sugar and not run out totally. So one of the things that I found with this, if I run my butter too hot, it will melt out. And I'll go back to that dough now that we're going to roll that out. And when we roll out that dough, if we have cracks in it, if there's a hole in it, that butter is going to be the first thing to want to charge out, and there'll be a pool of butter in the bottom of it. So again, stay with the cool. It doesn't have to be frozen, but stay with cold butter and just get it into pea size as fast as you can without heating it out. Now, when rolling out this puck, this is right out of the refrigerator. It is cold. It is tough. I'm just going to mechanically soften it and start warming it up with my pin. That's just a tapered dowel pin. I'm not really putting much pressure on it at all, because if I put pressure on it, it will split. And the edges will naturally split. If you take there's a couple different philosophies. If you take your dough up to room temperature, it's not going to split because the butter's soft. But if your butter's soft, you're not going to get as flaky a dough. Now, I've got a great problem starting to happen that I know usually problems aren't great, but there's a little crack in the bottom that's starting to show up. And you'll see my hand go right about where my index finger is. You see that crack? So that can become an issue, and there is a point where you're going to address it. But if you go way back to some of our first instruction, you'll know that flour and water make glue. And so all I have to do is take and just put my hand over it, and all I'm doing with this is just using the heat from my body to warm up that butter and warm up those ingredients just a little to pull that together. That's my first fix, because again, I don't want to add water if I don't have to. If that becomes a stubborn spot, which it will, then I'm going to just take a little bit of water, just a little bit, just dab my finger in that ice water, rub it over that spot, a little bit of flour, and that will glue it together. If you have cracks or if you have holes, you want to address them now. Even when you place your dough on the actual pan, you'll want to address it to make sure before you add any ingredients onto it. Otherwise, if you have cracks, if you have little holes, all of your liquid, all of your syrup, all of the stuff that's going to become this beautiful sauce inside, or this filling inside of your galette, will actually leak out onto the pan and burn. So there's nothing worse than that. It's kind of a bummer. You go to all this work and then it all runs out. So you don't have the luxury of having a pan like a pie pan to use this in. That's where I said there's positives and negatives, and there's things that are unique about this and fun, but there's certainly some challenges, especially if you make them large. I think the largest one I've made is about a 14-inch round, started with an 18-inch circle of dough, which in previous instructions I've told you that dough, or like pie doughs, are not they're kind of my nemesis. And of course they're the ones that we've had some special instruction on, and had people come in and you're just ready to take notes, and you see that they just throw flour together, they throw fat together, they throw their salt in, and it's like, good grief, and it comes out perfect. And they can roll it paper thin, and it's flaky, and you're like, how the heck did they do that? So it's just one of those things of time. So that little spot, I'm gonna throw a little bit of water on it, just because I want to make sure. You can see it's just a fingerprint, but that flour and that water together make that paste, and when they make that paste, it'll hold that together. That's a little trick to use when you're doing other doughs too. Just throwing a little flour on there, make sure that I don't have any other water, any dampness on there. And I'm gonna roll this up on the pin, and as I roll this on the pin to make the transfer to a sheet pan, this is how I'm gonna keep it from sticking, because it's gonna roll over on itself, and you'll have parts that stick and tear, and that's just natural. It's pretty hard to get it perfect the first round. There are other things you can do. You can roll this in between parchment paper. Some people roll it in between plastic. My best bet is just rolling it out straight up and then rolling it onto my pin. So I've almost got the size I want. I'm kind of, right now I'm just looking at my half sheet pan, making sure that I'm going to have the proper size that I want. Hit it one more time with flour so it doesn't stick to the pin when I roll it up. Because there's nothing worse than that. You get this really nice dough, and then you go to roll it up, and it either sticks to the actual surface that you're on, or right there you can see on the one side, you just lift it up, and you can address that after it gets onto the pan. You'll also notice that I threw a little flour under there, so I can work with that and navigate that. And that kind of dough, it does like to stick, and I don't want to over flour, but I don't want to under flour. So I hit it just about right. You might want to go a little more flour if you're just starting out. It's going to help you keep from sticking to the bottom. So I got my half sheet pan, and now I can just lay it. The other thing is, if I had to go across the kitchen, I would have a way to transfer it. Now, if you look at the upper part of the screen, you'll see a hole right there in the dough. All you'll do is, since it's warmed up now, all I have to do is squeeze that back together and press it out. Overall though, this dough is still cold. And so even with all that working, it's still cold, so it tells me I'm gonna get a flakiness. Now, I don't have any holes, I don't have any cracks, I don't have to worry about that. Just double checking everything. Anywhere that you want to push it together, now's the time to do it, because you're gonna add your ingredients right in the dead center. If you want, you can do this just a little handful at a time, or a little measuring cup at a time. I'm just doing the full straight on dump. I've done this enough, I know what I'm doing. But you want to try to keep it from going to the edges of your dough. You want to have a nice 2 or 3 inches around, and so you're stacking it up in the middle, because what you're going to do now is you're going to fold those edges over, and you want them to go about, I don't know, a quarter onto. So you definitely want it to come up the top. And you just keep folding that dough over. And that's going to create your pie shell. And it is worth, if this is like your first time doing it, it's worth going around and looking to make sure there's no cracks in the bottom. And what I'll tell you is with these 3 apples, this is stacked pretty high. It's a solid 3 inches tall. And in my calculation of time and temperature, we're gonna drop that down probably to around 400 degrees and run it for about, I know everyone likes the exact amounts, but every oven is different. Remember, convection, conventional, is it running on temp, off? I actually ran 400 on convection, so 375 on regular, because I needed enough heat to burst that butter out, to get that steaming, to get that flakiness. And so if you're in a conventional oven, I'd run it at 400. If you're in a convection oven, I'd run it, or in a conventional oven, run it at 375, and in a convection, I'd run it at the smart ovens, I'd run it at 400, which is going to push you down to about 375 convection. Approximately 20 to 25 minutes. What we're going to look for is the inside of this thing to bubble. I'm throwing an egg wash on there. This egg wash is just a straight up egg that has been mixed to where it's turned watery. So it takes a little bit. It's more than just a simple little mix, but I want it watery. And then I thought, you know, I love to sugar and crystallize the outside of it. So I'm going to sprinkle some sugar on. But when I was looking in my cupboard, I come across a little thing of turbinado sugar. It's just a little coarser raw sugar. And I'm going to use that instead. You can use just regular sugar. But the regular sugar on the outside of it does a couple things. It's going to give you a nice crust. It's going to give you this crystalline effect, so it'll have a nice look to it. And also it'll help extend the dough shelf life. And what I mean by that is, since this is a wet filling and you have a dry dough, as that sits and as it goes over a little bit of time, add time to it, the liquid from that's going to rehydrate that crust and it's going to become softer. That sugar on the outside will help keep a nice firm crust to it. So we're going to blast that in the oven, get it cooked, and then see what comes out. So this is what came out of the oven. This is sitting a little bit warmer than room temperature. I went ahead and took a chance and transferred it onto this, and I got lucky. So if we take a look at it, you can see that the outside has that crystallization on it from the sugar, and there's a few warm spots on there. The back of my oven seems to run a little bit hotter, so that's just a little note that next time I'd probably rotate it at about halfway through. If you go around and feel the actual crust, it's nice and hard, and that's what you want. The inside's still going to be soft. It's going to take time for the natural pectins and that sugar to set up, and it'll come together just like apple pie, but we want it to actually cool down a little bit before that. So the thing that I'm going to do next is I'm going to just take a simple icing, just a straight cream. I use honey or corn syrup that keeps it malleable, and powdered sugar, and just a little squeeze of lemon juice, and take and put it on there for some garnish. It just adds another little pop of color, and that will stay white. And the reason it'll stay white and it'll stay soft is because of that honey or that corn syrup. And so it'll be ready to cut and present as soon as it goes to the room temp. So this is what the final presentation looked like and the final cut.